Hello, editing Laundry here to just give an actual introduction to what I want this series to be. Essentially, I just want it to be a place for loglangers to come and share about their creations, their perspectives on loglanging, their experiences in the community, and just other facets of being an Engelanger that aren't often talked about in the wider conlang circles. I want this to be a place where people can come to learn about the world of engineered and logical languages and to see what the community's been doing in the last, few decades since I think for a lot of conlangers, their knowledge of Engelings stops in about 1985 and doesn't really continue past that. So I'm hoping to be able to bring the perspective of my fellow Nat Conlangers more into the 21st century, as it were, of loglangs and to see all the wonderful stuff that this community has been creating and pushing and promoting and discovering about language. It's a really fascinating thing. So if you are a loglanger or are involved in the community or are fluent in a loglang, I would love to hear from you. If you are interested in being interviewed, you can always reach out to me. I would just love to hear from all kinds of different perspectives, from different loglangs, different communities. I just think it's just a very valuable thing to have. So if you are interested, feel free to reach out to me. I'd love to have you. Thank you.
Oh, okay, perfect. All right. So fihi doi loi rumba pendo i i visvati la lojbau selkicrypoi and my Shilvao is not very good. But soy imi sos me la travuhe. I nauku I have a very exciting guest, honestly, for having for a first guest on a loglang podcast. This is such a great person to have. She is a musician, a lawyer, and a longtime member of the loglang community, as well as a creator of her own loglang. Please welcome La Janbe.
Hi everyone, I'm so happy to be here. Shoi shoi shbosoi and all of that.
If you'd
Okay.
like to give yourself an introduction, or we can just jump right into questions, either way's good.
Okie doke. So my name is Isabel Gardner. I'm also known as La Janbe in the Lojban community. That's Belle, if you're not familiar with the Lojban language. I run a YouTube channel called Noise and Bells, which is a conlang music channel where I write songs in various different conlangs. Lojban is kind of my primary one. I've also dabbled a bit in Loglan, Esperanto, and Tokipona, kind of some of the big ones. I even did a song in Klingon at one point, although I'm told my Klingon pronunciation is maybe not the greatest. I did my best, but I have a good time with it, and I just really enjoy bringing together my two great loves in the realm of art, which are music and languages, particularly constructed languages. I'm also a civil rights lawyer by day, I suppose. I practice disability rights law here in Salt Lake City, Utah. Um, and I play a number of different instruments. I play ukulele and piano, and of course percussion instruments, vibraphone, glockenspiel, and the like. It's sort of where I get the name from. But yeah, I'm super happy to be here and get to talk about conlangs, loglangs, and all their kinds of langs that might come up.
Yeah, like I said, I'm very happy to have you. Right, so yeah, you brought it up a little bit. First, I just wanted to ask a bit about your music. Like, what was kind of the main inspiration for you to decide to make songs at different conlangs?
So it's kind of a lot of different things, but I would say the main thing for me writing music in conlangs, I have always been the sort of person who finds it difficult to express a lot of really complicated and often fraught emotions in typical words, typical language, if you will. And At the time when I started my YouTube channel, I was kind of going through it, to be honest, and I had a lot of feelings and thoughts that I didn't really know how to put into words, at least not any words that I knew in conventional languages. And so I ended up turning to constructed languages as a way to kind of give myself an outlet for some of the stuff that I was thinking about, when ordinary language had failed me in some sense. And I found that logical languages in particular gave me the freedom to say a lot of things and in a way that kind of felt more expansive, more inclusive of the experiences that I was trying to convey to people. It was also a safety thing, I guess. It's sort of funny since my channel ended up kind of taking off and it ended up not being nearly as private as I had maybe anticipated. But I kind of thought, well, if I'm going to write songs in a language that nobody really knows or speaks, then, maybe I'll be able to put it out there and kind of, vent and let the steam off, so to speak. And then, it'll be out into the world, but in a way that, will be sort of insulated from others in some sense. That obviously backfired immensely when the first couple of songs that I posted took off on YouTube, but it was a blessing in disguise because now I get the opportunity to explore all sorts of interesting ideas, especially those relating to religion, spirituality, politics, mental health. So those are some of the topics that I like to explore in the lyrics of the songs that I write. And I find that constructed languages, logical languages in particular, really give me the freedom and the flexibility to express those things in an interesting and maybe kind of new creative way.
I see. So it's basically that outlet for you to be able to get your thoughts out sort of outside the confines of just one language, like just English, basically.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because sometimes people ask, how do you decide what language you're going to pick to write a song in? And that's the beautiful thing about knowing lots of different conlangs is they all have their own kind of unique structures. They have their advantages and disadvantages. An example of a song that I wrote using kind of the constraints of a specific language is Tokipona. Many of you listening probably are familiar with Tokipona, the simple language that only has about 130, I believe it is, words in it. I had this sort of wacky idea. I'm a big fan of the books of James Joyce, the modernist author who really played around with language in a lot of interesting and creative ways. He has this kind of stream of consciousness style and does a lot of really interesting things with, the English language. And you could even say at some points, in his later works, it's barely even English. He's mixing in all these different words from different languages. Lots of kind of interlinguistic puns and or cross-linguistic, I guess, and things like that, and just really kind of pushing the limits of what you can think of as literature. So I'm really inspired by that, and I thought that an interesting idea would be to write a song which, in a sense, contains an entire language. That seems maybe a little bit ambitious. The language that I picked for that, of course, what sort of language can I fit an entire language into a single song? Well, a language with only 130 words seems like a natural candidate for that. And so I wrote a song that was sort of inspired by James Joyce, his novel, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, which is sort of about the growth and development of an artist from childhood up through kind of finding his muse, his creative inspiration, and all of those things. And I did this in Tokipona in a way that I used all of the words in the language at least once. And I think most of the content words I only used once, except for maybe one or two. And the result is this sort of bizarre collage of ideas and terms, because in Tokipona, with only 130 words, those words have to be very broad in terms of the concepts that they're covering. And like you have a word kiwen, which means, I guess, stone is the usual gloss, but it can also mean hard, like physically, unyielding, or metal. It can refer to a lot of different kind of concepts within there. So the idea that I had was, if I can write a song in a language that is very broad and use these kind of expansive, maybe a little bit fanciful metaphors, it creates sort of um, a song that can be read in possibly hundreds of different ways. Anybody that looks at the lyrics, you can interpret it in different ways. On the surface, it almost is kind of nonsense. It's hard to even pick out what the meaning actually is. I had sort of an idea of what it was going to mean when I wrote it, but it's a bit difficult to, divine the specific meaning. But that was actually kind of the point of why I did it that way. And so that was sort of a way that I, used the language to my advantage in a sense. I've also done other things. I switch between Lojban and Loglan sometimes depending on what the structure of the syllables or of the meter might need to be. I recently wrote a cover of a song where the initial line uses a lot of imperative phrases, and in Lojban you have to add an extra syllable to do an imperative by well, in Lojban you have to how do I explain this without I'm not going to go into it's probably a little bit off more in depth than I need to go. I'll just say I ended up using Loglan for this particular language because in Loglan you actually drop a syllable from the sentence. You can drop the subject in order to make the imperative, kind of like it is in English. And so translating from English into Loglan with those imperatives was a lot easier without having to add too many syllables. It kept the meter more or less the same as it would have been in the original. So that's another example of some things. The way that I decide what which language to use when I'm writing a song. So it gives you a lot of flexibility. There's lots of different ideas you can explore with different conlangs, and I think there's a different there's a conlang for every song idea out there. It's kind of my motto.
I like that. It's definitely a good way to look at things. And I like too that you mentioned like using loglings too. I feel like, not to talk too much about like misconceptions and stuff, because I don't want that to just be the entire thing. But like I think so often conlangers think that loglings are very like rigid and very strict when there's quite a lot of flexibility. I mean, it's definitely not the same type of flexibility as a natural language or as many ngelangs, but like there's definitely ways to go. So I guess somewhat related to this, just talking about you and your sort of journey into loglangs. So you and I are actually similar in that many loglangers come from computer science or from programming or maybe from like more formal mathematical types of environments. But you and I are similar in that we're not. I am currently studying speech therapy, and then you, as you mentioned, are an attorney. So I guess what was kind of the draw to you to loglangs and to that side of conlanging?
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic question. So loglangs in particular, there is, I guess, some overlap in terms of the work that I do. I find it's probably not, I would say, the main draw to me, but I do like to mention it because it's something that people often ask when they get to know me if they happen to know what I do for work. There's been endless legal cases that have been fought and litigated over the interpretation of words and terms and syntax and all of that stuff. The United States Constitution is a particularly infamous example. There's all sorts of things in the Bill of Rights and other places in the various sections of the Constitution where the presence or absence of a comma, even something as simple as that,
Hmm.
can completely change the interpretation of the law in that situation. I know the Second Amendment is one example of that. That
I
people
was
have,
thinking of that.
yeah, the whole idea. What is a is it a well-regulated militia, which is the right of the people to bear arms, or is a
Mhm.
well-regulated militia um, inclusive of that right? Is it
Mhm.
it's kind of an open question there, and it's very consequential for how uh, the law gets interpreted. So having a logical language which is unambiguous syntactically is obviously very interesting. As a lawyer, sometimes I'm immersed in legal research, writing a brief, for this, that, or the other thing, fighting over the interpretation of some sort of regulation, and if only they'd written this in Lojban, then we wouldn't have to have this fight. But also
Mhm.
then maybe I wouldn't have a job. So I guess maybe that's, be careful what you wish for. But I think honestly, the biggest thing that drew me to logical languages is I'm a very like religious, spiritual person in my personal life, and it was perhaps a bit naive, and I still feel this way to a certain extent. But I think part of this was just not being as familiar with the language and how it works. I had this sort of idea when I encountered Lojban for the first time that like, this is the language that angels speak in heaven. This is the
Mhm.
a language that expresses things in terms of pure concepts, pure forms, if you will, and in a way that is almost separate from human language, where we're adding all these layers of abstraction and um, implication and and cultural understanding, all of that stuff on top of what the actual content of the message we're saying is. To me, it seemed, at least superficially, when I was learning about Lojban, that it sort of broke free from the trappings of human language in that way and allowed you to speak directly in terms of pure concepts. Now, I don't necessarily think that that's fully accurate now that I'm a little bit more familiar with it. I would say that it largely falls victim to a lot of the same issues that I should say, Lojban is a human language that natural languages do, in terms of, you can't force somebody to say what they mean. You actually have to think carefully, and no language that you can come up with, no clever design is ever going to take that off the table. You are going to have to say what you mean and be honest about what you mean, if or not be honest about what you mean, if that's what your intent is. But no language is ever going to like force you to speak in terms of pure form, pure ideas. So it's a little bit, I think, a bit of a misunderstanding of the nature of the project, and exactly what it worked, the way that it worked, in reality. But that was something that I was drawn to. Some things that I now kind of resent, the jargon words, selbri, brivla, sumti. If you've ever read a Lojban tutorial, you've probably run up against these and gone like, what the heck are these
Mhm.
words? Why do you need to say brivla when it seems like this just means a verb or whatever? Well, when I was first learning Lojban, I thought this was like the coolest thing ever. I was like, wow, it's so alien, it's so foreign. This really is like the language of angels, something that's otherworldly almost. And now we know, okay, brivla really is just a verb. Like, at least that's my argument. It's the same. Sumti is just a noun phrase or an argument. But I had kind of a mystical spiritual experience when I was first learning about Lojban, and I think that was what really like sucked me into it, to be perfectly honest. But yeah, that's sort of my unconventional journey into loglangs.
Really like that. I've definitely had that kind of thought too. Not quite the same flavor, but like of that mystical connection to loglangs almost, where like we come from different religious backgrounds, but for me, I was like, wow, this is so useful for being able to like kind of unambiguously like state something that you need and to be able to like construct and like organize your will or your attention and just focus it, and you know that there's not any way to like interpret around it essentially. So yeah, definitely want to put a pin in the spirituality conversation because I feel it will come up later. But yeah, you mentioned too like your understanding of Loswan changing over time. You are, I believe, one of the few like active conversational speakers in like the Losvan community. You're quite good with the language. Um, yeah, so you have a very rare gaze into how the language actually works. And over time, the community has started to see sort of the flaws in the design, the flaws in how it's explained and taught. We mentioned a bit with the jargon. So, one area I want to talk to is about specific kinds of reforms, and in particular, the reform known as Chiquitao. So, could you talk a little bit maybe about what Chiquitao is and sort of your view on it, how it's influenced you maybe?
Yeah, of course. So check it out for those of you who are not familiar with loglangs and Lojban specifically. Check is, how do I describe it? It's basically this kind of design philosophy, or honestly, kind of a philosophy about language in general, I would say, that in order to be as efficient as possible, in order to be as user friendly as possible, when we're talking about engineering languages, of course, sometimes if you're making a conlang, maybe efficiency isn't your concern. If you're making an artistic language that's supposed to be expressing a certain idea or designed for a kind of fictional culture, that might not be your concern. But if you're talking about language engineering, which is really central to logical languages, of course, and englangs in particular, or in general, excuse me. There's this idea that in order to be as efficient as possible, you should be able to express the most common concepts, the most common constructions should be the most compact, the most, user friendly, easy to work with, and small. That's both in terms of like the syllable structure or the syllable length. I call that syllable cost in the sort of parlance of the language engineering work that I have done. And also in terms of the like memorization load that you have to remember, because when you're speaking logical languages, unlike in natural language where a lot of those syntactic concerns are sort of handled automatically, you don't have to worry about closing terminating a subordinate clause, like you in a natural language, like you would when you're, say, writing a computer program. You actually have to put that curly brace on the end to make sure that you're not running into some other statement further down the line. That's what a logical language is like. So there's a lot of this memorization. You have to keep track of where you're at syntactically in the sentence. And you want to make, if you're going by a Czechitao sort of mindset, you want to make sure that those things are as compact and simple and easy to manage as possible. The term specifically originally referred to just the syllables. So the word Czechitao actually comes from this proposal. I don't remember who it was that actually came up with it originally. I know that La Solpachi, who is a very famous Lojbanist and musician, he wrote a lot of really excellent Lojban poetry and hip hop music, which you can find on Bandcamp, I think is where it is located these days. Czechitao comes from a group of particles that are in Lojban that were originally proposed to be modified in this way. So when I specifically in Lojban, there is what a lot of people, including myself, perceive as a design flaw within the language, where there's a lot of words that are very common that come up constantly that make the language very much easier to use when you're speaking it, that are longer than they need to be, because particles can either be 2 syllables or 1 syllable in Lojban. That's what the majority are anyway. And so you have 2 syllables or 1 syllable particles, and there are a lot of particles that are very, very common that are 2 syllables, whereas there are similar particles that are similarly shaped, but are only 1 syllable, that are used for some really, really obscure and niche kind of cases that very rarely come up. So the most probably glaring example of this is tau, which is the tau in Czechitao. So tau in the original Lojban language is a particle which makes the next letter, if you specifically use a letter pronoun, which I won't go into what that is right now, but you can basically, use letterals to indicate anaphora in some circumstances in Lojban. It will uppercase. It's like a shift key, basically, for the next letter. And that's what tau is. That's a 1 syllable particle that is exclusively used to uppercase a single letter, which, I honestly don't think I've thought, I can't think of almost any circumstance where this would ever come up in reality. Like, you're never going to want to shift key a single letter. And there's actually other ways of doing the same thing with other particles that, so even if you were to just completely delete that functionality from the language, it would really have almost, in my opinion, no bearing on the functionality of the language. Meanwhile, there is a particle tuha, which is extremely common. What that does is it basically allows you to kind of promote a concrete argument, like a person or an animal or a thing, or, to an abstraction, such that it can be used in a construction that would otherwise require an abstraction or like a subordinate clause, basically. So you can, if you want to say, like, I'm thinking about something, you would normally have to say, mi pensi lo duhu, I'm thinking about the fact of, and then you have to enclose whatever it is you're talking about in this, the fact of construction, in order for it to be correct in terms of type and not cause a type error. And if you want to just do that without having to deal with, closing the clause and all of that syntactic stuff, you can say, I'm thinking about a dog, mi pensi tuha lo gerku, basically. That turns dog into an abstraction implicitly. So this is very useful. It comes up all the time. You're always wanting to use this in order to kind of decrease the syntactic complexity of your sentences and your utterances. But tuha is 2 syllables and tau is only 1 syllable. And so, we think, like, well, if we could just delete the whole uppercase thing and not have any issues, why even have that in the first place? So somebody came up with this idea what if we just switch a couple of those? Basically, we say, okay, well, forget original tau. We don't care about the shift key sort of thing. We're just going to switch tuha and tau. So now tau actually does the thing that tuha used to do. And so now instead of saying mi pensi tuha logarku, I can say mi pensi tau logarku. And that is a lot, quicker. It's easier. It's better for poetry in particular, because if you're going to be writing poetry, even a single syllable can really like throw off your mojo, so to speak. And it's just really important to be able to have that flexibility. And so Cheki Tao is the name comes from, I think it was originally Cheki Tao Zhao, but Zhao has sort of fallen off, I guess. It comes from these three particles, she, ki, and tao, which are probably the most popular, at least at one time, to do this with. So we say in Lojban as a verb, we use Cheki Tao as a verb. I'm going to Cheki Tao this with this. And, so we Cheki Tao she for shehu, and we Cheki Tao ki for keha, and we Cheki Tao tao for tuha, basically. And so, but that's now been extended, essentially. The term Cheki Tao now kind of also refers to this idea more abstractly, more generally, that in order to be more efficient, we should keep things more compact, keep the most common constructions more compact. If you have to decide between, I'm going to assign this thing to a one syllable and this thing to a two syllable, whatever is the more niche case needs to go into the two syllable. Whatever is the more common thing should go into the one syllable. So it's kind of a design philosophy as well as a specific reform that is used in the Lojban language.
I see. It's a very nice explanation. I definitely know, like, as like a student, sometimes trying to like parse longer texts, so many particles are two syllables, and then a lot of root words are two syllables, and like, sure, they look different, but it can just kind of be tiring looking at like a text of just 2 and 4 and 5 and maybe 6 letter words with like the odd, like maybe 8 character lujo here and there. So it's definitely useful. And yeah, I'm sure it's very helpful too with like poetry and stuff. I know listening to like Zaho, I hear a few Checky Taos sometime, an album by Lasopahi. Like I hear like do for duhu and stuff like that. So it just makes it a lot easier and more of that flexibility. Yeah. So in this kind of theme of issues in Lojban and kind of like issues and reform in general, you are quite interesting for essentially going back. Loglan is famously kind of the predecessor to Lojban, and I feel like a lot of the popular view in the conlang community is essentially just like, Loglan was really bad, and then Lojban is slightly less bad, essentially. Even sometimes you get that a bit in the loglang community. So I'm very interested in your decision to kind of look back and go back towards Loglan. I guess, what do you see as maybe the value from learning from it? What do you see as the value in its current community and the current state of the language? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So a little bit of background there. So uh, as you mentioned, Loglan is the predecessor to Lojban. It was, Lojban was actually created as a result of an intellectual property dispute between the creator of Loglan and a bunch of kind of disgruntled Loglanists at the time. And so they created Lojban in order to have their, we're going to make our own loglang that's cool and, screw you guys. And so they made a lot of changes to it. A lot of those changes, I would say, are broadly positive. I think they did a lot of good things when they were moving over. But in some ways, I think they kind of threw the baby out with the bathwater. And there are a number of features that I actually think Loglan does better in some ways than Lojban does. So for context, I'm actually part of the Loglan Institute now. I am good friends with Dr. Holmes, who is the president and CEO of the Loglan Institute. And I actually just this morning was helping out at a Loglan meeting, which we still actively meet regularly on Saturdays in order to talk about the language and changes, updates, and things like that, new words and all of that good stuff. So I guess that's actually a good segue into probably the main thing I think that I like about Loglan is it actually still it's a living language in terms of the kind of official standard. Lojban the Lojban language is maintained, on paper by the Logical Language Group, or LLG, which we have a lot of, the community has a lot of thoughts about the LLG and kind of the way they've taken, or haven't taken, I suppose I should say, the language. For all intents and purposes, the LLG is defunct. They basically don't do anything these days. I think they have a meeting once every year where they essentially like redo the tax documents and stuff like that, and they make no changes to the language. They do not listen to feedback, and in fact, they are very hostile, I find, in my opinion, to requests for changes or feedback and things like that. They kind of are like, Lojban is what Lojban is. It's not changing. Deal with it, basically. Loglan, ironically enough, even though it originally came about because of the creator, who has since passed away, James Cook Brown, sort of exerting a very like almost authoritarian control over the language. The people who run it nowadays are very open to feedback and are constantly re-engineering things, changing things, adjusting the parser and the official documentation to make it more effective, more user-friendly, better as a logical language. And so getting to actually participate in that in a concrete way and contribute to the development of a pretty well-known and pretty well established and described conlang without having that sort of like, well, why would you want to change things? It's perfect. It came down from God, like it's well, I don't know, Lojban, maybe not the language of angels, Loglan, probably not so as well, but at least we're working towards making it a little bit more perfect, a little bit more getting at that vision of what James Cook Brown, originally kind of foresaw when he created the language originally. So that's part of it, I would say, is just the fact that it's moldable, it's able to be changed, it's not set in stone, because we're kind of going against the grain in Lojban. We make reforms, but there's always this stain of, well, that's unofficial. You're making reforms, you are Babelizing the language, making it unintelligible to new people, and so there's this tension there. People don't necessarily agree with the stuff that the sort of mavericks of Lojban are doing with the language in an effort to make it, in our opinion, better. So that's one thing. Loglan, there, like I said a second ago, there's a few things that I think it actually does better than Lojban. If you're familiar with Lojban, you probably know about attitudinals, which are these little adverb words that basically add kind of almost like a little emoji into the sentence. You can give context to, the something that you say, can be completely differently interpreted depending on like the way that your emotion is expressed. If you say like, I don't know, a good example, like, so we means happy. If you say we nai, that means sad in Lojban. So you say, we les dani shu spoja, yay, the house exploded, versus we nai les dani shu spoja, oh no, the house exploded. So like that's the sort of thing that you would be able to convey, in a natural language with tone of voice, with facial expression. But if you're just typing out in text, the reason I guess why people invented emojis when we started doing all this text communication, rapid fire in the internet era, is to kind of enable people to convey that sort of thing. And so that's actually baked directly into the structure. So attitudinals are a big part of logical languages, at least of the loglanic kind of family. I think that Loglan in particular actually does attitudinals better. So I used we and we nai in particular with Lojban. This is a little bit technical, so please forgive me. But you'll notice that there's we and then we nai sounds similar. So that nai at the end is basically like an opposite. It sort of unifies the previous attitudinal. So we meaning happy, we nai is unhappy, which is sad. In my opinion, those two emotions are not really the same thing. Like unhappy, like being sad is not like the absence of happiness. To me, those things are two completely separate emotions, and it's not the sort of thing that if you're smashing those together, it almost feels a little bit. In Lojban we say malgli, which is like bad Englishy. So it's something that is excessively inspired by, it's just the way it is in English. That's how we're going to do it here, and so there's these kind of cultural baggages that get imported into the language, whether you like it or not, by the design. In Loglan, by contrast, if you were to negate an attitudinal, it simply says that this attitudinal is not, it doesn't apply, basically. So if I say we is actually the same in Loglan and Lojban, we versus no we is happy, no we is just I'm not happy. It doesn't mean like when I say in English, I'm not happy, that sort of implies I'm unhappy, I'm disappointed, I'm angry or something like that. But if you say I'm not happy, it's just I'm not happy, and maybe I'm sad, maybe I'm neutral, maybe I'm terrified or something. I don't know. But it doesn't actually make any claims about the emotion other than I'm simply not asserting that this is done in happiness, basically. So, in my opinion, that's a little bit more neutral. It doesn't really bake in as many cultural assumptions about emotions and the way that those things work, as the way that Lojban does. And so I think that's something that Loglan actually does a little bit better. So that's just one example. I won't go into a million different things. There's lots of different ways you can compare and contrast the two languages, but I did hint at earlier also, there's ways that Loglan can be used in poetry that Lojban can't, due to the way that the sentences are structured and things like that. So to me, it's like, do I think Loglan is better than Lojban? I don't know that I would say it's better. Do I think Lojban is better than Loglan? I think they're both two unique and interesting and valuable insights and kind of approaches to getting at the same basic idea of a logical language in the era where this was sort of the only format that anybody had really considered up to this point. They're very similar, but also I think they both have their own use and they both have their own value. So I don't know. I really like Loglan. It bums me out that a lot of Lojbanists think that Loglan is this crusty old dinosaur language that nobody cares about, and it's just like a worse, it's the new Coke of Lojban, or I guess the old Coke, I guess. Doesn't really work that way, but it's just a worse version of the same thing. But I don't think so. I think it's worth it in and of itself.
Mhm. Yeah, I just find it ironic too because talking about like I remember when you first talked about how the logline community is actually allowing for innovation. Meanwhile, if you spent any time in the Lojban community, especially if you spent time in more open spaces, you've definitely heard of how we talk about like some of the higher ups in the community, the whole idea of Xexta, that kind of like pedantry and like nitpicking constantly, and just this resistance to reforms that make everything simpler, even if it's not a very complex reform. So it's just interesting to see that, different perspective instead of just feeling kind of like, well, I guess we're stuck with this language now, you know.
So yeah, the problem of Xexta in particular has been a real bugbear, I should say, in the Lojban community in particular for a long time. I don't think it's peculiar to Lojban specifically. I think it's a problem that pops up in basically every conlang community and in a lot of non-conlang internet communities as well. This idea that like there is one way to do things. There's the canonical kind of perfect God-given solution for certain ideas, and if you stray from that, then you are not only a heretic, you are like literally ruining the language forever, and you should be ashamed of yourself. Is like almost it's a very like it's almost like a cult like sort of mindset, very dogmatic, very authoritarian almost in the way that it comes about. And in Lojban that's usually manifest in the form of if you speak of reform in particular, if you request or advocate or God forbid use a reform of some sort in the language, then you are not only are you not speaking the language, the real pedants will insist like if you speak with a Chekitao replacement in your language, you're not just like speaking Lojban with a weird dialect. You are not even speaking Lojban at all. You are speaking some other thing, and you should call it something else. It almost reminds me of the people who are like, the food snobs, who will say that like, if you make a carbonara and you don't use this particular kind of meat in your carbonara, then it's not really a carbonara, or if you make a Philly cheesesteak and you use vegan or vegetarian meat instead of like real steak from an animal, then that's not a cheesesteak. You can't call it a cheesesteak. You can call it I don't know, a sandwich with vegan meat on it or something. It's like this incredible level of pedantry, and you have to wonder like, what do you get out of this? Like, do you not have
Yeah.
like anything better to do, I suppose? But it really is a thing. And, it's something that we have like really worked very hard to kind of eliminate from our section of the community over the years. Um, we, the Discord community, which is probably the most active and it's the pop-in place to be if you're Lojban speaker these days is lojbau guhe, the sort of pan Lojbanistan, I guess is what that would mean. And we created that as a reaction to Xexe in the Lojban community. The folks who wanted to talk, whether you're speaking perfectly official, CLL, BPFK, whatever you call it, from the big red book, that's totally acceptable. But also, other people who are going to speak in their own sort of way can do that and be free from, this pedantry. And it's been incredible just the difference that's made. It used to be you couldn't even talk about anything, even if you were speaking perfectly standard Lojban by the books. If you made a mistake or if you used like a word in a way that maybe is a bit unconventional, your conversation is done basically. Like you're not talking about, your trip to Canada. You're not talking about your problems at work that you're experiencing anymore. You are now talking about the grammar, and specifically you are repenting of your sins of doing it the wrong way. And so it just grinds the conversation to a screeching halt. Nobody wants to talk anymore after they've been hexshed. You basically just give up. And as a matter of fact, I actually started learning Lojban a long time before I actually became active in the community. I started learning around 2014, and it was long before I wrote any songs or did anything like that. And I got on the old IRC network, and I tried to talk and have a conversation after I'd learned a couple of things from the Lojban wave lessons, which is what I used to learn at the time. And I tried 2 or 3 different times, and every single time I would make a mistake or use a word in a weird way, and it was like getting dogpiled. Immediately there was like 10 people going like, "You did that wrong. You did it the wrong way. This is the way that we do things." And like, I was like, okay, but like I'm just learning. I want to talk about the cool lasagna that I made the other day. Am I not allowed to do that? No, you're not. We only ever talk about meta stuff related to the language, and typically they would just switch back to English at that point. Even which just made it even more frustrating. It's like you don't even want to speak the language. You just want to yell at people about it. So anyway, but thankfully, now that we've actually kind of excised that from the community, we literally had to make a new place to speak where that was just banned. We're not going to allow that anymore. If you hex somebody, you're going to get a warning, and if you keep doing it, you're going to get kicked out. Like that is what it took. Thankfully, nowadays nobody really does that anymore. It's become a taboo within the community to even do that. And so now, like it used to be, like basically nobody was fluent or anything resembling fluency. We use fluent a little bit, fast and loose in the Lojban community, but nobody really like had a proficiency to the point that you could be conversational. It took getting rid of that by force, basically, just to be able to get people feeling comfortable enough and friendly enough. Because why would you want, it's like the comic that Xexe comes from, the XKCD. If I learned to speak Lojban, I would only be able to speak Lojban with the kind of people who speak Lojban. Like, why, you have to like the people that you're talking to if you want to actually have a conversation. We're doing this for fun. This isn't, there's scientific and, philosophical aspects of it, but we're not doing this, we're not getting paid to do this, generally speaking. So, if we're not having fun, then what's the point? So anyway, but yeah, Xexe is really just, it's a disaster, and it affects other communities too. Esperanto, Tokipona. I know people in the Tokipona community have come up to me and mentioned like, we've got our own Xexe problems too, and it's just really vexing. But what can you do? I guess internet gonna internet.
Yeah, you mentioned, I guess it is a very human urge, unfortunately, to kind of wield your superior intelligence against people. So that's part of why I'm so glad that, there's the other Discord server. I got my start on like Lojban Discord because one day I was like, it'd be interesting. Lojban's kind of interesting. Maybe I'll see if there's like a community. And I joined the other Lojban Discord, not Rolsbogehe. This one's just called Lojban, and we usually call it Jbobracha or Hekuhe sometimes. And I remember, for one thing, even though it has, twice the members of Roseboguhe, it's a ghost town. No one talks there because no one wants to. And I remember just feeling so discouraged after like a month of being there. I muted the server, I like put it down at the bottom of my list. I was like, maybe I don't want to learn Lojban. And I remember someone sent me that XKCD as like a joke, like one of my other conlanging friends. And then I was kind of like, I get it now because it's true. And so then later on, I ended up finding that like, oh, there's the other Lojban server of like, nice normal people, like some of the nice people in like Jbobracha. I was like, oh, that's where they're actually active. And yeah, so there really is a nice community, and very fortunately, the nice community is the one that actually like does things with the language, and actually is creative and has expression and all this. So just really feels like shooting yourself in the own foot, essentially.
Oh yeah, no, it is really strange. You'd think like, well, we're all doing this because we love Lojban, we love the language, and we want to use it and actively, get something out of it. Why are we just, doing this? This just prevents growth. It prevents anybody from being interested in the language, and it prevents it from being used for anything other than talking endlessly, having the same, boring debates over and over again about this, that, or the other thing about the rules of the language itself.
Mhm.
It's really weird, but I guess you can't prevent people from, some people don't get into things like this to have a good time with friends. I like to think that's what most people are doing, but there are some people I think who really do it just to flex their intellectual muscle and be like, I'm so cool. I speak this funky computer, logic language, and that means I'm a genius. Basically, it's like, no, you're not. You're just a nerd like the rest of us. Shut up.
Exactly. But yeah, I guess speaking of developments in general and the loglang community and in general, just kind of growth and learning more about loglanging in general, you are a loglang creator. You have a loglang called Xextan. Um, I guess maybe first, do you want to just like tell us a little bit about what Xextan is kind of generally? Uh, yeah.
Oh, sure. Yes. Let me tell you about Xextan. No, I'm not going to do that. Yes. So Xextan is my loglang project. It's a little bit different than some of the other kind of we say post loglanic loglangs, which means loglanic referring to Loglan and Lojban collectively. And so the most famous and well-known post loglanic loglang is Toang, Toaq, which is created by La Solpahi, or I think he goes by Hoimai. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, in Toang, which I think also means it's like sun lover is what he goes by. And so that one is very, very different from Loglan and Lojban. It completely went off in its own direction. It uses grammatical tone to distinguish words, like word boundaries. So we call that self-segregating morphology. In a loglang, one of the requirements for something to be a logical language is that you have to have self-segregating morphology, or SSM, which allows the parser to distinguish where one word starts and another one ends. So in Loglan, Lojban, and some other languages, we use consonant clusters and stress to be able to tell where that happens. In Toang, they use tones, so it kind of went off in a completely different direction. And I think a lot of the people in the Toang community have a very negative view of Lojban and Loglan and want to distance themselves from it. It's almost like become a taboo within the Toang community, even talk about it. Xextan is not really like that. I wanted to create a language that was sort of like, I don't know, I guess I would say like if I was making Lojban or Loglan today, I'm going to take all of the good things about that and sort of put my own spin on it, incorporate a lot of what we've learned over the years from speaking Lojban and Loglan, and start from less of a like complete blank slate and more of a like, okay, I'm going to do something kind of like Loglan and Lojban, but make it more, Janbe, I guess. And so the word Xextan, the name, we mentioned Chekitao earlier. So Xextan actually comes from Chekitao. That's where the name comes from. In an older version of the language, the phonology was a lot more restrictive. And so I basically converted the word Chekitao into the phonology of the language. And the closest thing I could render it as was Xextan, which is very different from what it actually sounds like. I've changed things around such that you could actually say Sheki now, and you'd be able to have that be a word. But that's sort of where the name comes from. And as that implies, the whole idea with Xextan is I want to make a Cheki language. I want to make a language that is as compact as possible while also being still useful and usable and all of those things. I was heavily inspired not only by Lojban and Loglan, and a bit by Toang as well, but also Tokipona, which is obviously one of the most popular, if not the most popular, conlang on the internet at the moment. And I think the reason why Tokipona is so popular is because it's so accessible. The learning curve is pretty steep. In order to get really good at Tokipona, you have to put a lot of effort into doing it, but anybody can pick it up and learn how to express themselves, in a matter of, a couple of days, probably. It's really quite straightforward and accessible to people. And the thing with Tokipona, of course, is that, like, in order to talk about more complicated stuff, you can do that, but you have to add more and more information. It takes a lot longer to be able to express yourself, and you have to have a really good intuition for how to, kind of break down concepts into their most atomic individual things. You have to be a teacher, basically. Every person who is really good at Tokipona has to be, a teacher and really fundamentally understand the stuff they're talking about. So I really admire Tokipona. I think it's great, but it does obviously have its flaws in terms of, practicality for at least kind of more, intermediate or new users who haven't really fully grasped that yet. So one of the things I wanted to do with Xextan was have a language sort of like Tokipona, where there is a fairly minimal number of words, so you don't have to memorize a whole lot of stuff. And, you can do a lot with very little, but it still gives you the flexibility to be able to do that in a way that's not extremely verbose. So, you want to be able to express things that are as complicated as you want to, but have it be still compact, not have to say, take a really long time expressing this, that, or the other thing in order to be able to express yourself. You can pick it up and go. It'll be more complicated, of course, than Tokipona, but, less so than Lojban and Loglan. And all based around that idea of if the most common concepts, the most common constructions should be the most compact, the easiest to use and implement without requiring as much syllables, as much memorization load on the user. So that's why I called it Xextan after Xextan, because that is sort of the central philosophy of the language. The words are all CVC, consonant, vowel, consonant, or consonant, consonant, vowel, CCV for the basic root words, and then particles are consonant, vowel, or consonant, consonant, vowel, and things of that nature. And that is, again, with the basic idea being, the basic root words, which we have at the moment, the way the phonology is set up, there's 500 possible root words. I think at the moment we have 300-ish that are actually currently existing. And the idea, of course, being in the spirit of Xextan, if I want to come up with, a word for something, I should be able to build that out of the most basic concepts, and therefore the root words are going to be the most basic concepts available. You can stitch those together to create more complicated things. So, for instance, I have a word for electricity, cha, and I have a word for weather or sky, which is zul. And so if you wanted to say lightning, like, being struck by lightning or whatever, you could put those two things together, zulcha, basically sky electricity, to make the word for lightning, basically. And so that is like an example of how you would form kind of a typical word in Xextan that is more, we think of lightning as being sort of a subset of electricity, and so therefore electricity should be the shorter concept. It should be, a single syllable, and then if you want to be more specific, you can add more detail and do things in that way. And we've kind of moved more towards that idea of, you can be as general as you want or as specific as you want. You just have to add more information as you go. And that's sort of something that the language has tended towards over time. It's what me and the folks who've been working on it have sort of found to be the most useful and the most kind of harmonious with the way that the language is constructed. And we recently implemented a major reform, which really kind of goes off in a kind of, treading where no loglang has gone before, in some sense, where even the place structure, the x1 does x2 to x3, the argument structure of the verbs, the predicates, at the most basic level, if you have a single verb, if you have a single root word, there actually is no defined place structure at all. It's all x1 is somehow related to this concept, basically. And then if you add more arguments to that, it becomes, you can make it more specific that way. And then in order to actually achieve a definite, a defined place structure, you can add suffixes on to the verb, and that will give you a specific place structure that is more similar to like what Lojban and Loglan and Toang and the other loglangs do. So this is kind of heresy from a traditional loglang perspective. It's like, well, how am I supposed to know exactly what this means? And it's like, well, you don't really need to. Syntactically speaking, that's actually it's syntactically entirely as unambiguous as anything else. What we're doing is making it more semantically ambiguous. And we think semantically, ambiguous, we don't want things to be ambiguous. We're speaking logical languages. Why do we want ambiguity? Well, the thing is that ambiguity is actually not always a bad thing. Ambiguity can actually be very powerful. If somebody that you're talking to knows what you're talking about already, it's the same way that Tokipona works. If you speak enough Tokipona and you know what somebody means when they say, a certain word that might have a number of different meanings, if somebody can understand based on context, then you don't have to do all of the explaining and going into the background and giving this whole lecture on what it is that I'm talking about and define all of your terms. You can just speak and go right ahead, and you can be as efficient as you want. And you can do the same thing in a logical language. There's no reason why you can't do the same thing in a logical language as you would in a more artsy kind of language like Tokipona, for instance. So, you can use ambiguity to your advantage. Xextan allows you to be as specific as you want or as ambiguous as you want. And if you know that your audience is going to understand what you mean, you can say it very, very quickly and very simply in a very small number of words. And if you're concerned that maybe they're not going to get the meaning, you can always add things and make it perfectly unambiguous. So you can go from, the more words you add, the less ambiguous it gets until, it becomes as clear as, the summer day, basically. And so that's the idea of Czechitao again, is like, if it's as basic, the broadest stuff should be expressed in the shortest, most compact, most simple kind of phrases and words and things like that. So it's all Czechitao all the way down, basically. So that's the idea of Xextan, sort of from a 1,000-meter view, if you will. And but we're excited to see kind of where it goes.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Definitely, I mean, so much there. Definitely reading the grammar. I very much feel that sense of Czech guitar. I remember showing friends who are like somewhat interested in loglang, but they don't know a lot about different loglangs. They just like to read about semantics and stuff. I remember showing them, I'm like, oh my goodness, this construction is so compact and it's so simple. And I was like, well, there's this sentence in Lojban, and then there's this one in Xextan, and it's like half the size, but it's still like so clear. And I remember just being so like excited and blown away about like, it doesn't have to be so verbose. It doesn't have to be so extra. And what you're saying about Toki Pona reminds me, I feel like right now the community, like there's that discussion happening in a lot of spaces. I've seen like Jan Lipamanka talk a lot about it, about how Toki Pona is actually kind of difficult in many ways. It's like difficult to get that mastery. And it's a lot of people who aren't fluent kind of like jumping in essentially and saying like, well, this is so easy. And then people are like, well, hold on. Well, we're fluent and we don't really know what you're on about, There's that. And then I'm just so excited to see where the language will go to, especially with the place structure, because place structure is probably the thing I struggle the most with loglangs, with like both learning Lojban, trying to remember what place is where, and like, especially with Lojban, it's so difficult to remember what type of like abstractions to use and that type of thing, versus like making a loglang too. Like, I'm still trying to learn how to like incorporate place structure into like a sign language, for example. And so the idea of kind of like having everything be intransitive and having like transitivizers, it's so interesting because I see people do that with like more artistic conlangs or more naturalistic conlangs. Like I have friends who've done things like that, but then seeing that incorporated into a loglang just feels so special and so interesting. So I guess that leads into one of my first questions, sort of about like, I guess Sheshtam broadly. You've mentioned Toki Pona, like we both mentioned that already. And there's another pseudo loglang called Changli, and pseudologling is like a language that's like very close to being syntactically ambiguous, or maybe it's close to having an SSM, but it's not quite there. And Tokipona can actually be argued to fall into that category. So I guess my question, or So Chengli is also something you've cited as an inspiration in Xextan a little bit. So I'm curious then, I guess, what would you see? We've talked a bit about this, but like, what would you see as the potential value of sort of having more of those like pseudo loglang characteristics and not being so locked into the traditional kind of like strict syntax of loglangs that we've been developing over the years?
Sure, yeah. I mean, the thing with pseudo loglangs, I find, and like you said, Tokipona even can be considered a pseudo loglang, which I'm sure some Tokiponists would have conniptions thinking about that. But it's true. The interesting thing with pseudo loglangs, and you can see this with Tokipona in particular, is kind of like what I was talking about earlier. It's a lot more accessible. In Lojban, you have to be very, very deliberate about the way that you construct things. Oftentimes, if you start speaking and you're going off on a sentence and you realize that you like forgot to say something or there's something that you need to add, there are certain places you can get to in the sentence where you're kind of stuck. You can't get back to where you were. And when you're speaking Lojban, you have to be very deliberate. You can get into situations where you're halfway down a sentence and you realize you forgot to add something, and oh no, now I need to go back and do this. But you can sort of get into situations where you're kind of locked in and you can't go back and fix it. So you often have to just start over your sentence. And especially when I was very first starting out, I got into a lot of, I would be talking to myself in the car or whatever, and I would end up having to rephrase the same sentence like 100 times because I didn't really have a sense for, where things go yet. And there's ways of avoiding that. And there's sort of strategies you can use to make things easier in that regard. But it's not really a problem that natural languages have because you have that flexibility. Again, that ambiguity sometimes works in your favor. If your audience knows what it is you're trying to say, you can just sort of toss in a subordinate clause, at the end there, and they'll know what it refers back to. But in Lojban, you throw in a subordinate clause, it goes in a certain slot, it goes to a certain part of the sentence, and that is where it goes, and there's no argument about it. And so pseudo loglangs, to different extents, like play around with that idea. Most of them are more on the kind of rigid side. Otherwise, they wouldn't be pseudo loglangs at all. They would just be kind of an art lang. But they aren't as afraid of getting into some of that stuff, and so that's kind of the idea with we're calling it Xextan 1.5 because I think that's the revision that we're on right now. Some of the ideas that are being introduced with Xextan 1.5 are kind of looking at that pseudo loglang idea, and seeing what is available within those ideas that can actually improve the utility of the language and make it more efficient rather than less efficient. So that's probably, I mean, the one that I already mentioned is probably the best example of that. There's other things that I could probably think of too. But also, I would say that pseudo loglangs tend to be a little bit more artsy about the way that they construct words and the aesthetic of things. There's this idea of cultural neutrality in logical languages that has been debated endlessly, and you can argue whether whether it's even possible to have something be fully culturally neutral. And earlier loglangs like Lojban and Loglan were very concerned with, we have to be as culturally neutral as possible. We can't be favoring one language over another. And I think broadly speaking, that's probably a good idea. We want to make things accessible. We don't want things to be super Englishy or super Mandarin-y or super Spanish-y or whatever, just because that happens to be a language that people speak. But at the same time, like, there are certain things about natural languages that are actually beneficial, like I was talking about. And you don't want to run away from naturalism just because, oh no, spooky natural language, like, it's actually fine to have an artistic flair. Toang, I think, does this really well. It very much has its own aesthetic and has its own kind of idea of what it wants to be and what it wants to look like. It adopts kind of like a like Southeast Asian kind of language aesthetic when it's constructing its words and the orthography and all of that stuff. It's kind of like Vietnamese or Thai a little bit in the way that it kind of looks. And pseudo loglangs, I find, often are not nearly as afraid of kind of adopting a little bit of that flair. Tokipona in particular is, to me, it looks very like, Hawaiian or Polynesian, or, maybe like I think Tok Pisin, the Papua New Guinea language, Creole, was or Pigeon, I forget which one, I think it's Pigeon actually, um, is a major inspiration, and so you can see the aesthetic there. In Xextan, I've done a little bit of that. The use of the X as the character representing the sh sound is something I sort of borrowed from Portuguese and Basque, which are two of my favorite natural languages. I really enjoy Portuguese in particular, and kind of the sound and the aesthetic there. I incorporated phonemic nasalization as a way of helping to manage scope in subordinate clauses, which, you know, I use the tilde to do that directly from Portuguese as well. And so I don't know, it's like it's both a practical thing as well as, you know, it introduces a bit of flair or a little bit of, you know, intrigue to the language that you might not otherwise have. That idea that people have of loglangs as being very rigid and unflexible and, you know, robotic almost, you know, like it used to be, people would say things like, you know, Lojban is this language where it's not possible to write a love poem. You know, it's like, well, that's not true, first of all, but like, you know, that sort of idea, like the fact that people even like think that to begin with is like, we need to do away with that misconception. And, you know, it's a human language, we speak it, people are speaking it, it's not intended to be spoken by robots, it's intended to be spoken by people to help improve human communication, you know, if such a thing is even possible. So yeah, I don't know, there's lots of things that can be learned from pseudo-loglangs and even, you know, completely not loglangs, natural languages and other kinds of constructed languages that you might not think to look to for, you know, advice and wisdom on engineering language.
Yeah, I feel like inspiration can come with conlanging from just so many sources, and I definitely can see that with loglangs. Like, I feel like a lot of loglangs, especially pre-Tawang, were very boxed into this like sort of but not quite European aesthetic is the best way I can put it. Or it almost kind of became like an Ouroboros essentially, where it was like where it's almost like its own the aesthetic of Lojban or of, you know, Loglan. Like I've asked people who aren't interested in loglings, like, oh, what does Lojban look like or sound like? And they're like, it looks and sounds like Lojban. It doesn't sound like anything. And yeah, I feel like Toong, like you mentioned, is definitely a big step in the direction of like breaking out of it a bit, because it's this very like, you know, it has this very kind of like Mandarin tone system, and it builds words like Thai, and then it has like a VSO word order, and, you know, it has like its own kind of lore associated a little bit with it. So it's just like such like a new fresh approach. The sense I get, I mean, this was way before I got involved with the community, but the sense I get is that Talon kind of was like, oh, it's actually okay to like, you know, just do the thing, you know, like take that interesting decision, like take that leap and like try something out, try something new, you know. It doesn't all have to be like reduxes of the same thing. It doesn't all have to be like improving on the same thing. Like, you know, you can take inspiration from your past, but, you know, you can look towards the future. You can look outside of the bubble and get sources from wherever. Yeah, so I find that interesting. Just like seeing all the inspiration from like different conlangs and different natural languages in Cheshtan, I feel like it's just, yeah, it's just a very underrated part of like trying to find ideas and trying to find solutions to problems with loglangs.
Yeah, it's okay to have a little fun with it, you know. We're all doing this as a hobby. We're not, you know, it's not serious business. Like, I don't know, maybe for some people it is, but to me it's beautiful. It's a way of expressing yourself. And if you are always afraid of failing, maybe you try something out, maybe it doesn't work. I've done that a million times with Stretch Time. I've tried something, you know, Lord only knows the, you know, the fine folks who I actually had to have somebody else help make a parser for me because I'm not very computer oriented. So there's a Sheshtan parser. It's very good, but I didn't really have much of a part in that other than making the language itself. But you know, I know that some of the folks who work on Sheshtan have like, I've come out with some new idea and they're like, oh no, you know, Janbe's innovating again. You know, what's going on here? What's she gonna do? You know, and sometimes it just really doesn't work and it crashes and burns. And you know, thankfully, I am very receptive to feedback. If somebody's like, you know, this ain't gonna work. You know, like this is a huge mess. I'll be like, okay, you know, I'll take that under advisement and I'll, you know, look at it and eventually I'll decide, you know, okay, this isn't working. We're going back to the drawing board. You know, it's okay to do that. You know, people think in loglangs in particular, like if we start doing this, if somebody introduces reform, that's just going to permanently alter the language. If we do this sort of idea, if we go off in this direction, there's no way to go back from that. It's permanently, changed forever. It's like, no, it's not, like either it catches on and people like it becomes influential, or it doesn't and it just disappears into the ether. Like we don't have to be afraid of that so much. It's okay to fail. It's okay to try new things, even things that are really weird and out there. That's part of the fun of it. So we should have fun, even if we're doing, the logic part. I think people get the wrong idea. This is science, this is math. It's like, well, a little bit, but it's also art, it's music, it's poetry, it's spirituality. It's all of those things.
Exactly. It's less scientific than people think. Like there's a ton of science, but at the end of the day, it's language. We still don't know how the brain quite understands language. And I say this as someone who's gonna have to take a whole huge class about how does the brain attempt to understand language. So yeah, it's just like have a little fun. And then lastly, just because we are starting to get close to time, lastly, I just want to touch on the spirituality conversation again, unpinning that a little now. So there's this idea in Xextan that I saw in some of the resources and in the Discord server of the Cinco Shilati. I think I'm saying that right. But from what I see, it definitely has kind of a spiritual value and like a spiritual connotation. So I guess just in that case, could you talk a little bit about what those are and about maybe the utility or interest of using spirituality and combining that with conlanging? Because I feel like that's a pretty unexplored avenue, kind of theme of the
Yeah.
day. But
Oh yeah, yeah. No, I'm really glad that you asked that. A huge inspiration, like I mentioned earlier, is for my conlanging in general and interest in other conlangs is spirituality. I consider Hildegard von Bingen, the Catholic mystic from the I think 1200s. She is kind of my unofficial patron saint. She is actually considered to be the person who invented the first documented constructed language, which is called just lingua ignota, unknown language. I think it's just called that because we don't really know a lot about it. But she was obviously a mystic and very, very spiritual, very devout in her beliefs. And she created conlangs as a way of exploring the mystical in her own life and, sort of learning how to talk to God and experience the divine in new ways. And so, you mentioned that Toang has a little bit of a spiritual kind of mystical component as well. And so I was very inspired by all of those things in creating Xextan in particular as well. I don't think that Lojban is necessarily the language of angels. I don't think that Xextan is either, but it's as close as I can get to expressing that in my own terms. So Senko Shirati means spirit signs, and these are kind of symbols or signals, placeholders, archetypes. It came from a dream that I had a long time ago, where after I had already been working on conlangs for a while. This was before I had ever gotten into Xextan at all, but it was something I later incorporated into Xextan. I had this idea for, I don't know if language is really the right word, but sort of a system whereby concepts could be expressed that are common to all living things, all living beings that have a sensory experience, or maybe even ones that don't, in some fashion can experience each of these things. And so there's 9 of them. And I kind of identified concepts from the natural world that I thought were sort of fundamental to the experience of living in the material world, full of chaos and hardship and, suffering, destruction, but also joy and, wonder, all of those things as well. So they are words that are syntactically or morphologically, they're like borrowed words, what I call free words. In Lojban, we say zihevla, which so free word is kind of a calque of that. So they're like not part of the core like root words, but they are just as much core and root to the language as anything else. They're basically used to give some spiritual component that isn't directly tied to a specific religion or cultural background other than Xextan itself. And you can use them in as metaphors. They're supposed to be sort of a kind of shared cultural experience of anybody who speaks Xextan can learn the spirit signs and use them as metaphors. So I'm not going to go into all of the spirit signs since there's 9 of them, and you can actually look it up. They're on the Xextan website if you are curious. But the kind of most basic of the spirit signs is Kanoka, which I call the nest. Basically, this is the idea of safety, goodness, family, home. That's the kind of idea. You know, if you are an animal in the jungle, the kind of ideas of being safe and having all of your needs met are kind of encapsulated in this idea of Kanoka, the nest. And sort of the counterexample to that, or the counterpoint, is Wawa, which I call the maw, is the English name, basically. That's sort of the opposite, basically. We're looking at lack of safety, lack of food, the things that are, that one needs to survive are not present, danger, predation, destruction, death, all of those things. You know, if you're a prey animal of some sort, then this kind of defines your experience. You know, they've actually done studies and found that like birds that are prey animals in their ecosystem, if you play the cries of predators that are familiar to them and observe the birds and their neurology, they actually exhibit some of the same symptoms of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, that humans do. And so it's sort of this kind of cosmic tragedy to me that we're all placed into this world where, you know, it's not just an unfortunate fact of life, but a necessity that living beings kill and destroy each other and have to in order to live and survive. And so that actually, that idea of that tension is the spirit sign Yoa Yoka, which is the sky, the world, creation, basically. In my religion is Gnosticism, and in Gnosticism there is this idea that the world was created by not a benevolent God or creator God, but in fact by a flawed demiurge who essentially didn't really know what they were doing when they put the world together, and either intentionally or unintentionally created a world which is seemingly set up to maximize the suffering of the beings that inhabit it, basically. And so there's this tension both between safety and the lack thereof, predator and prey. What is Kanoka to one being might be Wawa to another, and vice versa. And that is what we call Yoa Yoka, this tension, this primordial chaos that we all live in, basically. So that's a couple of examples of the Senko Shirati, the spirit signs. Like I said, you can look them up if you're interested. It's not something you have to be, I'm not running a cult here. This is just sort of me putting my ideas out there. You don't have to be religious or buy into any of this stuff. This is a genuine expression of my spirituality. I honestly do believe this. It's part of my my religion, part of my spirituality. But in terms of Xextan, it's just the language. You can talk about these things, use them as a metaphor for something. If you do really well on a test, or if you if you are feeling really strong and feeling really good about yourself, you might say tenni e tiyoti. Tiyoti is the sun, power, basically potential. So you can use that. Or tiyoti, if the wind is really strong, it's like, oh, it's tiyoti, it's very strong, it's causing a lot of things, it has a lot of potential, it's inflicting its will on the world in a sense. So it's used as they're used as metaphors, kind of a shared cultural background that isn't connected directly to any kind of real world culture, other than I suppose my own experience and understanding of spirituality. And that is intended to give people an ability to use metaphors and things like that might not be directly tied to one culture or another. You can still use metaphors and other things more conventionally, just like you would with any language. That's totally fine. But it's sort of an interesting idea that I had that I decided to incorporate into Xextan. So yeah, those are the spirit signs.
I really like it. I remember, I mean, I come from more of a witchcraft side of things. I'm a seeker in Wicca. And so to me, it really reminded me of like just concepts of like making oracles, essentially. Like tarot is a very famous oracle, or you can read like Elder Futhark runes. Some people do that. And so to me, this reminded me a bit of that, of these like bits of significant meaning almost. Yoa yoga especially reminds me of like the Wheel of the Seasons, a very prominent concept in witchcraft. So I was like, I just remember seeing that and feeling kind of, I guess, seen or just very like, oh, because I guess it's not really like a stereotype, but like it's just a thing. Like a lot of people in the conlang community, I feel like don't talk about spirituality or they avoid it for, one reason or another, often, perfectly valid reasons. So I find it so interesting that like, there are people, I was so happy to see that there are people like, kind of crossing that boundary. There was that presentation at LCC. I forget the name and I forget who did it. I'll put it up in post, but there was someone who had that presentation about magical languages, and they also talked about like using magical languages for real practice. And so it was just so interesting to see that there are like these tie-ins with like spirituality and mysticism and conlanging that go so well together. I mean, you mentioned Hildegard von Bingen. you know the first conlang was a very kind of mystical thing to happen. So yeah, it's such a fun part of Xextan to see.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up like tarot and divination and things like that. That was part of what I was kind of inspired by. I'm not very well versed in tarot, but I have dabbled a little bit in the I Ching, the Chinese divination text. And the I Ching is all about kind of like tarot is. It's very much, I am not a very superstitious or magical kind of thinker, but the way that I see it is basically, if you are asking a question with and receiving an answer, quote unquote, with the I Ching, it gives you kind of like a very general and vague kind of response to the question that you are asking in the moment. And your task is basically to figure out how it applies to your particular circumstance, and even if you don't, you might, interpret that in a more, literal kind of magic way, or, one could interpret it any number of ways. To me, like whether or not you believe in any sort of spirituality or magic or anything like that at all, there's still kind of a value there. It forces you to think about something from a different perspective, and you can find things in that sort of divination that you might not have otherwise considered, and it might open up a new sort of insight into your life and into the world. And so I kind of incorporated that a little bit into the spirit signs. There is a symbol that is associated with each one of them. And I don't know if I have those anywhere up on the internet. I'll have to put that up on xextan.github.io, which is where you can find a lot of the Xextan information right now. But they're designed in such a way that they're kind of like the tarot cards or like the I Ching, where you can see like any number of things in the symbols, basically. So Yoa Yoka in particular, it looks kind of like it's kind of like two, like a greater than and a less than sign kind of superimposed on one another. And so to me, like I can see a number of things in that. You can see like a strand of DNA being like, the, life and the fundamental essence of life being this kind of intense tension between forces. It also kind of looks, if you look at it another way, it looks kind of like an M and a W pressed up next to each other, which is actually the symbol for Kanoka looks like an M, and the symbol for Wawa looks like a W, basically flipped upside down to represent that they're really the same thing in a sense. What is Kanoka for the predator is Wawa for the prey, and vice versa. So you can see any number of things in those symbols, and they're deliberately designed in such a way that you can kind of pick out your own meaning and see what it means to you, and sort of opens the mind in a sense with that, if I can be so bold. But yeah, it's I also kind of share that vexation that a lot of folks have in the conlang community. I think a lot of people who are involved in conlangs come from backgrounds which, for one reason or another, they have a very negative association with religion and spirituality. I completely understand that. I was raised in the LDS, the Mormon Church, and I definitely have a lot of traumas and hangups as a result of that. For a long time, I thought there's no way that I would ever want to be religious or spiritual. This is just a bunch of mumbo jumbo, and it just hurts people. There's no good in it. And it was only after having some really intense kind of, spiritual experiences sort of against my will in a sense, that I kind of came around to the idea. And I don't necessarily intend to like proselytize. I'm not trying to tell people like you have to be spiritual to understand Xextan. You don't have to, do all these things to be interested in conlangs or loglangs or in any particular one. But I do hope that at very least it might, give people a different insight or think about things in a different way. That's really the point of the spirit signs, and really broadly speaking, the point of Xextan in particular is to, really open doors and, bring that fundamental insight out a little bit.
Yeah, I really like that. Yeah, it's just so interesting to see, yeah, just a different take. And so I guess with that, very excited to see what Xextan 1.5 will bring. Very excited to see all those new reforms that you talked about. And very happy to have you. You have such an interesting point of view when it comes to loglangs that I was just so happy when you agreed to do this with me because I was like, oh, yes, this will be so interesting. I really love seeing like your messages and your point of view and really kind of like seeing how you kind of approach loglangs in I guess, just like a different way from a lot of people.
Oh, you're too kind. No, it's honestly, it's my honor. It's been such a pleasure getting to talk to you. I'm super happy to get to talk about some of these things and nerd out a little bit with somebody who is really immersed in conlangs and all of that stuff. And yeah, no, it's been wonderful, and I really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you so much.
Yeah, kihedo.